Hello and welcome back to Math and Tea, the show where we talk math and drink tea. I'm your host, Professor Joseph Anti. It's been a bit of a while since the last episode. November was a hectic month, and most of December's been one too. I'm actually using tea bags to make my tea again, and I don't normally do that. Anyway, I want to finish off talking about Andrew Hacker and his critiques of math education policy. Let's go back to Hacker's primary argument and outline it again. First, he believes that certain math classes, algebra, calculus, and so on, are not valuable to many of us in our careers. They are extraneous. And second, these same extraneous courses are just too difficult, the most difficult courses that students face, and therefore they're causing a host of problems, everything from lowered confidence to lower GPAs, which of course affect a lot of things down the line. And as a consequence, he argues that math classes should be terminated, truncated, or at the very least made optional. Now, as a logical argument goes, this is actually kind of a bad one. Let's follow what happens when we keep going with it. So now we've gotten rid of math, so now math is no longer the most difficult required course. But something else will be. Maybe it's chemistry, maybe it's history, maybe it's PE. I know it was for me. And whichever course it is, did we really need that course? Did we really need to know about oxidization reactions, or the War of 1812, or how to dodge a dodgeball? Well, maybe some of us do, but for most of us the answer is still no. So out it goes. And the next thing, and the next thing, until we're left with absolutely nothing but the barest essentials of education. And if you look back over education history, you'll see lots of times where we boiled everything down to the barest essentials. And it wasn't good. It's the whole reason why we put all of the requirements we have there today. Clearly, something is wrong with Hacker's logic. Now, some course will always be the most difficult. You can't really get away from that. The problem comes from his assumption that the only benefit we get out of a math class, or indeed any class whatsoever, are the skills and techniques we take from it and apply to our careers. Now, many people, if asked, would say that the reason why we should teach math widely is because it helps us learn critical thinking skills. Hacker does address this in his book. He believes that the arguments connecting math education to critical thinking skills are overblown. And I think there's a germ of truth in that. Math is necessary for critical thinking skills. It's a good marketing slogan. It's the kind of thing you see slapped on the covers of books aimed at grade schoolers, although really with those words you're aiming at the parents and trying to get them to do the right thing for their kids. While Hacker believes that the case for math's benefit is overstated, I think he is also clearly understating it. Hacker takes a hard line and says that there's no benefit to be gained in other skills from learning math. And to me, that doesn't make a lot of sense. After all teaching is based on the idea that we are pattern learners. None of the problems we see in our job or in our daily life will ever look quite like the ones we see in class, but nonetheless, we still think that the education is valuable. Why? Because we can extend beyond what we learned. Let me illustrate this with an example from my own life. Back in high school, when I turned in my first essay, I think it was a history essay, I got a terrible grade on it. It just wasn't well written, and it wasn't until I started thinking of essays in terms of a math argument that I started to get better at them. I started to treat those 5-paragraph essays as logical, mathematical arguments, with each line needing to lead into the next, into the next, into the next, until I reached my conclusion. Later on, when I became a professional mathematician, the process actually reversed itself. I was writing math papers, and I started to think of those math papers in terms of story structure, because I didn't want to just explain an argument. I wanted the argument to make sense. I wanted the reader to understand why I did what I did. And to do that, I needed to start thinking in terms of narrative flow and story progression. Now, I wouldn't expect that to work for everyone. It's what worked for me. And I think that's really the key. Everyone is different. Everyone learns in their own way. And we won't know what works best for any given student until we've exposed them to a broad range of ideas. And that's part of the reason why I will fight just as hard for history classes and English classes as I will for science and math classes, even for scientists and mathematicians. So I believe that the benefit of a math education should lie somewhere in between the two extremes. Somewhere between it benefits everything else and it benefits nothing else. And this is where I have to remind people that I'm not an expert in education or the psychology of learning, so take all of this with a grain of salt. But what little bit of research I was able to look at suggests that this is really true. For example, with critical thinking. Most things I found were benefiting critical thinking. Math was one of them, but a lot of other things helped too. Okay, so I've been arguing for the benefit of mathematics education by talking about widely applicable skills, and there's a lot more that could be said about that, but let me end on two last points. First, math classes force us to master the simpler material. In order to be good at a calculus class, you have to be good at algebra. In order to be good at an algebra class, you have to be good at arithmetic. It keeps working down and down and down. It forces us to make those simpler skills innate. And for another reason, well, remember back to my very first episode? I talked about why calculus is such a hard class for so many students, because it's the point at which we go from mathematics being a nice, simple, linear algorithm to being a big, branching, complicated algorithm. And maybe, even if there's no other benefit to a math class whatsoever, that's a useful thing to expose students to. Well, that about wraps it up for Hacker. I'm sure I could say some more, but let's save that for another time and move on to a new topic. But that's all until next time, because I'm out of tea again. Except, no, I'm really not. I'm sorry. I have to talk about a few more things. They're just making me so angry, and I have to get them out. I have really, really tried to be cordial to Professor Hacker throughout this entire series. You know, I try and respect other people, even if I don't agree with them. But there's a few things he does that have just... Okay, I'll just explain what they are. At one point in his talk and in his book, he asks whether or not there's any connection between mathematical skill and political freedom, democracy. Still don't know quite why he does this, but okay. As evidence that there is no connection between the two, he brings up the International Mathematical Olympiad, or IMO. The IMO is a competition which pits each nation's top young mathematicians against one another. And if you look at the nations that do best at the IMO, you'll certainly notice a lot of democratic governments, and a lot of very non-democratic governments, autocratic or dictatorial, as you like. And so Hacker concludes there's no relationship between mathematical talent and political freedom. But this is bunk! If we're going to look at the state of math education in a country, we can't do it by looking at a small select group that might have had a bunch of resources put into it. We have to look at the entire country. And the other incident is something Evelyn Lamb pointed out in her review. At one point, Hacker talks about the gender gap in mathematics, the belief that men are better at mathematics than women. And I should point out that Hacker soundly rejects this idea, and I do too. However, at one point in his books, he says, well, and let me quote directly here, debates about gender-based capacities don't arise in other intellectual areas. I mean, seriously, this only makes me question if he's ever been in an intellectual area. That's it. Tea's gone. I'm out.